Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Tonight, we journey once more into the calm, mystic air of Middle-earth, where shadows fall long over ancient mountains and secrets lie deep beneath the stone. If you've had a long day, now is the time to let it all go. Settle into a quiet corner, wrap yourself in your favorite blanket, and breathe in gently. Let your shoulders drop, your eyes soften, and your thoughts slow to the rhythm of the tale. This story isn't in a rush, and neither should you be. Together, we'll follow the soft steps of Gandalf the Grey, long after his battle in Moria, as he uncovers a hidden truth sleeping in the West. This isn't a story of war or fury. It's a story of memory, of light, of fire that waits to be understood. Let's leave behind the noise of the day and walk slowly and peacefully into the quiet world of wonder. The vast silence of Moria was heavier than stone. Where once thousands of dwarves toiled and laughed under vaulted ceilings, now only echoes and shadows remained. Gandalf the White stepped lightly through the Hall of Records, his staff gently tapping the ancient flagstones. He moved with a reverence befitting both a wizard and a witness to its fall. The memory of the fierce battle on the bridge of Khazad-dûm still burned fresh in his mind. There, he had faced Durin's Bane, a Balrog of Morgoth, ancient and full of fire, and had fallen with it into the abyss. But death had not held him. The Valor had sent him back, cloaked anew in white, with deeper wisdom and a task still unfinished. Yet now, standing once more in the tomb of Balin, the silence whispered to him, not of peace, but of something left undone. The wind that filtered through broken arches bore an unnatural chill. It stirred old parchment and dust, and as Gandalf approached Balin's resting place, a low moan followed behind the breeze, faint and almost sad. The tomb lay cracked, its stone lid bearing a faint scorch mark that had not been there when the Fellowship passed this way. Gandalf's brows furrowed as he ran his fingers along the crack. Magic had touched this place recently, something ancient, something that had tasted fire and shadow. He closed his eyes, listening, not just with ears, but with his very being. Deep within the stone halls, he could sense echoes, not of Durin's Bane, but of something similar, yet distant. A different rhythm. Another soul of flame. A second Balrog. He whispered the thought into the tomb's stillness, and the silence that answered chilled him more than the wind ever could. Long had the wise believed that Durin's Bane was the last of its kind. The Balrogs, forged by Morgoth from corrupted Maya, were believed vanquished in the War of Wrath, save for this one, hidden beneath the misty mountains. But what if there had been others, wounded, hiding, or sleeping in forgotten corners of Middle-earth? Gandalf stood still for a long while, his staff dimly glowing with white light. He thought of fire flickering in dark caverns, of shadows deeper than night, and of how the Balrog had fought not like a solitary creature, but like one driven by a purpose, as if it believed it wasn't alone. That thought disturbed him, yet he knew better than to ignore it. The truth had a way of surfacing, and when it did, it often brought danger in its wake. He stepped away from the tomb, letting his light guide him toward an old side passage, unused since the time of Durin Estatis. The walls here were rougher, the air more stagnant. Faint markings glowed beneath the surface, runes he hadn't noticed before. They weren't dwarvish. They bore a cruel elegance, not elvish either. Ancient, fiery, and grim. Gandalf traced them with his staff, and a shiver passed through him. They were warning signs, not in words, but in intent, placed to ward off something that had once slumbered behind these walls. He pressed his palm against the stone, and a brief flicker of resistance met him, then passed. He felt the ghost of heat, like a breath exhaled from the past. Something had stirred here in recent months, something that had been watching, waiting, and now, perhaps, had begun to move again. In a small alcove, Gandalf discovered remnants of what seemed like a burnt journal. Dwarvish script scorched beyond legibility, yet a few fragments survived. He knelt, brushing away ash. One phrase repeated itself, barely visible. Eyes of fire in the west. Echoes not of this hall. His pulse quickened. The west, beyond Moria, across the plains, to the distant blue mountains. Ered Luin. Could something have fled there when the first Balrog awakened? Was Durin's bane merely a beacon for another to rouse? Gandalf stood slowly, eyes narrowed. He had come here seeking closure, perhaps to honor Balin once more. Instead, he had uncovered a path of uncertainty, one that could lead to fire and ruin, or deeper understanding. As he made his way back to the main chamber, the sound of dripping water echoed like a ticking clock. Time, it seemed, was running ever thinner. If another Balrog lived, if even one more had survived the fall of Morgoth, then it must be found before it found others to fuel its wrath. Gandalf reached the threshold of Moria's exit, pausing one last time to glance back at the ruins. He did not speak, but in his heart he sent a silent farewell to Balin, to the Fellowship's past trials, and to the darkness that had changed him forever. A whisper on the wind followed him out. Not alone. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The journey west had begun, and with it, the unraveling of a second secret buried in fire. The halls of Rivendell welcomed Gandalf with their familiar blend of serenity and subtle wisdom. Elrond's house had always been a refuge for the weary, a place where time felt slower and thought could stretch without end. The leaves rustled with the sounds of elven music, and the air carried the scent of ancient woods and river mist. Yet Gandalf's heart remained restless. As the sun dipped behind the misty mountains, casting golden threads over the valley, he climbed the steps to the library, where the oldest records of Middle-earth were kept in shadowed shelves and velvet-lined drawers. It was here, among the musty parchments and long-forgotten scrolls, that he hoped to find traces of a presence never meant to be remembered. Hours passed beneath the flickering oil lamps, and Gandalf's fingers moved through the brittle pages with care, like turning the leaves of history itself. He read old dwarvish battle accounts, elven songs of the First Age, and faded maps bearing markings of realms that no longer existed. Each line tugged at distant memories, but none held what he sought. His staff leaned against the table beside him, its white tip dimmed in quiet thought. Then, in a leather-bound volume tucked behind a misfiled ledger on Númenórean ship designs, he found a curious note. No more than a folded sheet slipped between chapters. It bore no title, no author's name, only lines hastily scrawled in Sindarin. The ink was faded, the script rushed, but the words chilled him. A flame unseen moves westward still. I saw it once, on the cliffs of Forlond. Fire without smoke and shadows without bodies. He read the line again, then a third time. Forlond, the elven haven on the western coast near the Blue Mountains. Few travelled there now, and fewer still reported anything unnatural. The writer had not signed the note, but beneath the scribbled lines was a date, Third Age, Twin 998, just 3 years before the Fellowship's journey had begun. Gandalf's brow furrowed. Had this been dismissed as a poetic vision? A fevered dream? He dug deeper into the shelf where the note had been hidden, and to his surprise, uncovered another parchment, clearly older and more damaged. This one bore a circular mark scorched into the corner, like a brand rather than ink. Its contents were nearly gone, but a phrase caught his eye. Not all that fled in ruin perished. Some buried deep, waiting for fire to call fire. The sentence struck him with a force like thunder. It aligned with his darkest suspicion, that Durin's bane was not merely surviving, but perhaps sentient in its search. A signal calling out across the deep places of the world. The Balrog he had defeated had fought with a fury that felt kindled, not accidental. And now, the idea that another of its kind, dormant, buried in the ancient folds of the Western Ranges, might have stirred, made the quiet of Rivendell seem suddenly too still. He gathered the pages, wrapped them in cloth, and rose slowly. Elrond would want to know of this, but Gandalf knew the urgency was not in council, but in movement. There was no time for council debates or drawn-out songs of warning. He would go west, alone if needed, and seek the truth. Before departing, Gandalf wandered the gardens of Rivendell, seeking clarity beneath the starlit sky. The night air was cool and the stars shimmered like the eyes of the Valar watching from afar. He murmured to himself, a habit he'd never quite dropped, weaving thoughts aloud to steady his mind. "The fire moves westward still," he repeated, "but it leaves no ash, no scent. It is not a thing of flesh, but of essence, a memory kept alive." He touched the carvings of an old stone bench, feeling the smooth, weathered lines worn by time and rain. If fire remembers fire, then the past may yet rise again in flame. The wind stirred his cloak, and somewhere far off, an owl called into the trees. He knew the path ahead would be long, but he also knew that inaction was the greatest folly of all. By morning, he had already packed. His white robes glowed faintly in the dawn light as he descended into the courtyard, where Elrond met him with a look of silent understanding. They spoke briefly of the note, the signs, and the need for secrecy. "Do you believe it is truly another Balrog?" Elrond asked, his voice calm but tight with concern. "I believe something stirs," Gandalf answered. "Whether it is one of them or something worse, I cannot say. But I must know." Elrond nodded and placed a hand over Gandalf's own. "Then go with the blessings of the House of Elrond, and should you fall into shadow again, may the stars remember your name." With no more words, Gandalf mounted a grey horse lent by the elves, swift and silent, and rode out into the waking day, the road bending west toward lands where few now walked, and where fewer still dared to listen for fire. The journey through Eriador was quiet, the old road winding like a faded memory. Villages lay scattered, their chimneys smoking in peace, unaware of the ancient threat that might sleep beneath the very mountains that framed their skies. Gandalf rode swiftly, stopping only when the horse needed rest or the moon hung high. In the distance, the peaks of Ered Luin rose, sharp and cold, their snowy tips reaching like fingers toward the heavens. He could feel something already, like a pulse in the stone, a thrum too low for human ears. The mountain remembered something, and it vibrated faintly with the echo of a name never spoken aloud. He camped one night beneath a crag near the edge of a dried riverbed. As he closed his eyes, a strange sound hummed in his dreams. Not a voice, not a cry, but the hiss of embers in silence. When he awoke, the morning frost had melted in a perfect circle around his staff. Gandalf knew then, with a certainty as clear as the sunrise, that he was no longer chasing a theory or mere superstition. Something was guiding him, perhaps even waiting. The pages he had found were not warnings. They were invitations, whether written by fear or fate. The fire in the west was real, and whatever it was, it had not forgotten the world it once tried to consume. The road turned harsher as Gandalf neared the foothills of Ered Luin, the blue mountains that loomed vast and silent before him. Their snow-draped ridges stretched endlessly across the horizon, brushed with silver by the light of the rising sun. These peaks had once echoed with the songs of dwarves, long before the kingdoms of Erebor and Moria rose to power. Now they stood quiet, their passes overgrown and forgotten, except by wind and time. Gandalf dismounted at the edge of a long abandoned path once used by miners. He whispered a word in the ancient dwarvish tongue, and the stones beneath his boots hummed faintly, as if remembering voices long since faded. He tightened his cloak and stepped forward, drawn not just by instinct, but by the strange heat that pulsed beneath the ground like a slumbering heartbeat. The deeper he climbed, the more uneasy the land became. Small animals, usually bold in spring, were nowhere to be seen. The air was unnaturally still, as though the very mountain was holding its breath. In the cliffs above, Gandalf spotted a dark crevice, not wide enough to be called a cave, but unnatural in shape, as though something long ago had split the stone from within. As he approached it, his staff brightened without command, casting pale light into the narrow opening. What greeted him was not the smell of moss or earth, but the faintest trace of ash. Not fresh, but old. Centuries, perhaps millennia old. And yet it lingered stubbornly, as if the mountain had never quite healed from what had touched it. Inside the crevice, the rock walls grew smoother, as though scorched and reshaped by heat. Gandalf crouched, examining a faint pattern embedded in the stone, a swirling mark, jagged and spiraled, reminiscent of fire coiling around itself. He had seen such shapes before, in the ruins of Thangorodrim, the mountain fortress of Morgoth. "No natural flame made this," he murmured, voice low. He pressed his hand against the mark, and for a fleeting moment, warmth flared beneath his palm, not burning, but unmistakably alive. He pulled back, startled. Whatever had passed through here had not perished completely. Its essence still clung to the walls, soaked into the roots of the mountain. He was not just following a trail. He was entering the lair of something that had once burned with the wrath of the ancient world. Gandalf stepped further inside, and the air grew heavy, not just with age, but with memory. Whispers began to fill his ears, words not spoken aloud, but imprinted on the very rock. They were faint, garbled, like echoes from a dream. In the darkness, the murmuring stones seemed to speak of firestorms under deep stone, of wings without sky, and names long erased by the tides of time. Then one whisper grew clear, as though piercing the fog of ages. "He waits." Gandalf froze. It was no mere remnant. A consciousness was awakening, or had never slept. He raised his staff, and the white light surged brighter, casting shadows that twisted and recoiled along the jagged corridor. Something was listening. Perhaps something was watching. At the end of the passage, the crevice opened into a chamber that had not been shaped by tools. It was as though the earth itself had ruptured inward, creating a vast hollow with scorched stone ribs arching above like the skeleton of a fallen beast. Blackened stalactites hung like frozen tears from the ceiling, and at the center of the room lay a circle of cracked stone within which nothing grew, not even dust. Gandalf approached slowly. He knelt beside the circle and studied the markings that surrounded it. Ancient runes, not of dwarves nor elves, but a tongue forgotten even by the Maya who remained in Middle-earth. Fire script, the writing of the Balrogs, used only when they bound their wills into the very stone and flame of the world. One word pulsed among them, repeating in a broken spiral. Yarog-Zun, a name that had not passed through mortal lips in over an age. He whispered it, carefully, reverently. Yarog-Zun. The chamber responded not with tremor or sound, but with silence so deep that even Gandalf's breath felt intrusive. He sensed it then, not a creature moving, not eyes peering from darkness, but a presence, faint, bound, enduring. This was no random remnant of fire. This was the prison of something unfinished. Unlike Durin's Bane, who had roamed freely in Moria, this one had been trapped, perhaps wounded, perhaps left to rot beneath the mountain by Morgoth's own design. And yet, the seal was weakening. Time or fate, or the fall of its kin had stirred it. The death of Durin's Bane had not ended its purpose. It had signaled a new beginning. Gandalf stood slowly, his face grave. The runes, the whispers, the warmth in the stone, they told a story not just of slumber, but of hunger. If Yarog-Zun had once been second in fire to Durin's Bane, what might it become, awakened in an age of dwindled defences? The North had no great watch now. The dwarves were scattered, the elves were leaving, and men did not believe in ancient terrors they could not name. He turned and began his ascent back toward the mountain's mouth, the weight of the chamber pressing on him like a burden. He had not spoken to the creature. He had not dared. But it had felt his presence. It had heard its name. That was enough. Fire remembers fire. And now, the second Balrog knew that it was no longer forgotten. The descent from the chamber of Yarog-Zun felt heavier than the climb. Each step Gandalf took down the blackened corridor seemed to echo not through the stone, but within his chest, as if the mountain now remembered him. The whispers had ceased, but the silence had become stranger, no longer passive, but expectant. Outside, the sky had dimmed with the onset of evening, and the wind carried the chill of unseen watchers, rustling dry leaves like breath drawn through ancient lips. Gandalf's horse stood where he had left it, untethered yet unmoved, its grey coat flecked with dew, and its eyes wide with unease. Animals sensed what words could not speak. He touched its neck gently, whispering words of calm in the tongue of the West, though his own hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the weight of understanding. That night, Gandalf made camp far down the slope, where the trees grew thick enough to conceal light, and the earth no longer pulsed with warmth. The stars blinked above, veiled by clouds, and the fire he lit was small and smokeless. He did not sleep. Instead, he sat with his staff across his knees, and the old notes from Rivendell spread before him, now newly significant. The runes of Yarog-Zun, though different in form, resonated with the marks from the note found in Elrond's library. What had once seemed a scattered warning was now a map of a larger truth. Morgoth, in his waning strength, had not merely unleashed his creations, he had hidden them, anchored them to the roots of Arda with fire and will, planting seeds of terror that could outlive even his fall. Gandalf closed his eyes and let his thoughts drift backward through time. He remembered the fire of the Balrog in Moria, its hatred, its vastness, its memory. It had spoken no words, but its rage had been articulate. It had fought not to win, but to destroy, to erase the light that had once bound it. What if Yarog-Zun was not merely another of its kind, but a different form altogether? A guardian, perhaps, left to awaken only if others fell? Gandalf knew the Mire were not all shaped equally. Some had been twisted into singular purposes, moulded by Morgoth into weapons more ancient than war. Could Yarog-Zun be one of those? A sentinel, now sensing its isolation in the void left by Durin's bane? He rose before dawn, unwilling to wait for more signs. He needed guidance not from elves or men, but from those who had lived long in shadow. There was one place, hidden still beneath the western hills, where ancient voices might still speak. The Hall of Stone Memory, a ruin of the old dwarven realm of Tumen Sahar. Built before the fall of Beleriand, it was said to house carvings of vision, records not merely of speech or deed, but of spirit. If any place could show him the origin of Yarog-Zun, it would be there. It lay several days' ride to the northwest, past the River Lune, through dense woods untouched by time and largely unmapped. But the path was not unknown to Gandalf. He had walked it once, centuries ago, with Thorin's grandfather, before the world had changed. The journey was harder now. The land bore scars from ages of quiet neglect. Trees had grown thick over old roads, and streams had changed course. Yet Gandalf's pace did not slow. He moved like a shadow, visible only to the stars and the stones. Along the way, he encountered no one. No elves, no dwarves, no wandering men. It was as though the mountains themselves had closed their doors, knowing what stirred beneath them. At night, he avoided fire, choosing instead to draw warmth from old spells whispered into his cloak. And always, in the silence between wind and branch, he heard the echo, not of words, but of a breath, deep and slow, like something buried still dreaming. On the third day, as the sun dipped low and painted the clouds with the hue of embers, he found the threshold of Tumen Sahar. Time had not been kind to it. The gates, once carved with the likenesses of Durin's kin, now lay cracked and partially buried. Moss grew thick upon their faces, and ivy clung to the runes like creeping hands. But the entrance held. With a gesture of his staff and a quiet word, Gandalf stirred the dormant enchantments woven into the stone. The gates responded with a slow groan, parting just wide enough for a man to slip through. Inside, darkness reigned, but not dead darkness. Living shadow, rich with memory and deep with the breath of stone. He lit the tip of his staff and stepped within. The Hall of Stone Memory stretched vast and silent before him. Pillars of obsidian and quartz rose like frozen trees, each carved with thousands of lines in the dwarvish script of Khuz-Dul. The ceiling shimmered faintly, with traces of mirrored crystal reflecting Gandalf's light in dozens of soft beams. He moved slowly between the pillars, reading as he walked. The stories began with the shaping of the mountains, then the birth of flame in the deep. There were tales of Ola's hands, of the first forge lit in song. But deeper still, toward the back of the hall, the script changed. The words grew sharp and tangled, and the stone took on a darker hue. Here were carved warnings, not of war, but of watchers. One figure recurred across the pillars, a being of flame bound in chains of stone, with wings not for flight but for shadow, and eyes like burning wells. Gandalf traced his fingers over the final carving. Below it, in a basin of black marble, a single phrase was etched in mirrored silver. The one who hears the fall of flame and rises in silence. He stepped back, the truth setting heavily on his shoulders. Yarugzun was no echo of Durin's bane. It was a sleeper, tied not to rage but to balance, to correction. Where one fire fell, the other would stir. It was not revenge. It was restoration of a dark order Morgoth had once tried to establish. A legacy not of rebellion, but of return. And now, the balance had shifted. Gandalf turned toward the entrance, his staff dimming slightly. The world would not be ready. But the flame beneath the mountain was no longer waiting, it was listening. As Gandalf stepped from the depths of Tumanzahar into the cold breath of the morning, the sky had dimmed under a quilt of steel-grey clouds. A storm loomed above the arid Luin, thick with rain and wind, but Gandalf paid it little heed. The revelations of the Hall of Stone Memory had reshaped his thoughts into a sharpened blade of urgency. The return of Yarugzun was not merely a threat of violence. It was a part of a cycle, ancient, deliberate, and malevolent. Where Durin's bane had fallen, Yarugzun would rise to complete what had once been left undone. His path was now clear. He must warn those who still held watch over the western lands, though they were few. And yet, in his heart, he knew that words alone would not suffice. Proof was needed, tangible signs of what stirred in the deep. He would have to draw closer to the source of the fire, to find what remained beneath the stone. The river Lune wound its way like a silver snake through the hills, a glimmer of life amid the growing gloom. Gandalf followed its course westward, his robes damp with rain and his thoughts heavier than ever. He recalled tales whispered by elves of old, of a place where the river dipped beneath the roots of the mountains, into a cavern called Siladun, once used by smiths and wanderers, now long forgotten. Some believed it was a fissure carved by the Valar in ages past, a scar upon the earth sealed by time. But others spoke of strange lights glimpsed through the mists there, flickers of fire with no torch to bear them, and the scent of brimstone where none should be. If Yarugzun had begun to stir, its breath might be felt even there. That was where Gandalf would go, seeking the echoes of fire in the cradle of stone. It took a day and a half to reach the mouth of Siladun, hidden behind a veil of ancient trees that leaned low with the weight of years. Gandalf parted the underbrush with care, his staff glowing faintly to light the hollow. The entrance yawned like a toothless mouth in the hillside, wide and low, rimmed with moss and weeping water. The air that flowed from within was warm, not the breath of earth, but something older, dry and bitter, carrying the scent of soot and copper. Gandalf stepped inside slowly, his boots sloshing through shallow streams as he descended. The walls around him pulsed faintly, not with sound, but sensation, as if the stone bore memory in its bones. The deeper he went, the more the temperature rose, until the air shimmered slightly with hidden heat. And then he saw it. A fissure in the cavern floor, narrow and jagged, from which a dim orange light glowed, steady and alive. He knelt beside the fissure, gripping the edge carefully as he peered into the abyss. Far below, he could just make out the faintest movement. Shadows writhing slowly, not of creatures but of flame itself, coiling like smoke in reverse. It was not a natural fire. It did not flicker. It pulsed. Gandalf extended his staff, letting a single strand of white light pour downward. And in that instant, something moved. A tremor, not in the earth, but in the light. The flame bent away from it as if retreating, and from the fissure rose a sound, not a roar, not a scream, but a sigh, long and low, like a bellows exhaling after an age of slumber. It was not loud, yet it filled the cavern entirely, pressing against Gandalf's chest like invisible hands. The Balrog was not yet free, but it was awake. He stood quickly, whispering words of sealing, drawing old runes into the air with the tip of his staff. The magic caught upon the fissure like frost, shimmering for a moment before fading. It would not hold long, not against a being of fire and will, but it might slow what was coming. Gandalf turned back, heart pounding beneath his grey robes. He had what he needed: evidence, certainty, and dread. Yarogzun lived, and more than that, it remembered. It remembered the fall of Moria, the death of its kin, the silence that followed. That silence had now ended, and it was rising not as a beast, but as a flame reborn. The deeper truth lay not in its fury, but in its purpose. It did not climb to rage. It climbed to complete the design of an ancient darkness. Outside the cave, the storm had broken. Rain lashed the hillside, and wind tore through the trees like whips of anger. Gandalf walked swiftly through it, letting the weather cloak his retreat. He did not speak aloud, but in his mind he summoned names: Elrond, Galadriel, Radagast, even Saruman, though he doubted the White Wizard would heed such warnings now. The time for secrecy had passed. If Middle-earth was to endure, the old alliances must stir once more. The enemy had left behind more than orcs and trolls. He had left roots, buried deep, and now those roots had begun to bloom again in fire. He travelled through the night, resting only briefly beneath the boughs of an old birch grove where the rain could not reach. Even in sleep, he dreamt of flame, walls of fire twisting like serpents, and a voice behind them, low and ancient, speaking in no language yet understood. He awoke with a start and realized that it was not a dream, but memory. The Balrog's memory, brushing against his own through some unseen tether. He wrapped his cloak tightly and pressed on. Time was narrowing. The flame beneath the river had stirred, the silence of the mountains had cracked, and Gandalf knew that before long, fire would seek air, and shadow would walk again beneath the stars. By the time Gandalf reached the wooded vale of Lindon, dawn had broken across the western sky like a soft-spoken promise. Pale light filtered through the ancient malin trees, gilding the leaves with a gentle golden sheen. This was one of the last untouched places in Middle-earth, where time flowed slower and memory lingered long in the trunks of trees and the stones of the riverbanks. Yet even here, Gandalf could feel a tension humming beneath the peace, a subtle discord in the song of the earth. Birds sang with less confidence, and the breeze carried whispers of unease, as though the land itself awaited news of the flame that now stirred in the dark belly of the mountains. Gandalf pressed forward, his steps firm but unhurried, his staff tapping a steady rhythm against moss and root. At the edge of a shallow stream that glistened like glass, he was met by two elves in silver-grey cloaks, their faces ageless and their eyes cool with the weight of centuries. They offered no questions. They simply nodded and turned, guiding him silently through the woods. The path wound upward, leading to a small stone glade encircled by white trees whose bark shimmered faintly even in shade. There, beneath a canopy of golden leaves, stood Elrond, tall and calm, his hands folded before him, his gaze resting on the horizon. At his side stood Galadriel, radiant as the moon, her presence serene but sharp with knowing. Beside her, Radagast waited, his robe still bearing traces of mud and moss, his eyes alert with the intuition of those who speak with beasts and birds. And lastly, to Gandalf's surprise, was Glorfindel, the golden-haired warrior who had once battled a Balrog and returned from death with fire still lingering in his soul. "I see the silence has ended," Elrond said softly as Gandalf approached, his voice like wind over still water. "It has," Gandalf replied, his tone low and deliberate. "The second flame has awakened. Yarogzun stirs beneath the western stones, and the breath of fire can already be felt in Ciladun." Galadriel's gaze narrowed. "It has begun then," she said, as though completing a thought spoken long ago. The design Morgoth buried deeper than his armies. Flames bound not to conquest, but to continuity. Gandalf nodded and recounted all that he had seen. The glyphs in the chamber, the whispers in the deep, the basin of mirrored runes in the Hall of Stone Memory, and the breath of fire he'd felt rising from the fissure below the river. He told them of the way the Balrog had not moved to rage, but to remembrance. How it had responded not with wrath, but with awakening, as if recalling a task left unfinished. The others listened without interruption, their faces solemn. And when he finished, silence fell again, this time heavy with understanding. Radagast, who rarely spoke in such councils, broke the quiet. "If it is awakening not for destruction, but completion," he said, "then we face not merely battle, but balance. A restoration of a design none but the darkest minds dared contemplate." Glorfindel's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "And what of the flame's heart? Did you see its shape? Was it still bound to form, or has it begun to scatter into formlessness?" "It was coiled," Gandalf replied. "Not like the beast in Moria, which roared with hatred and hunger. This was different. A presence that waits, that remembers, and it knows of me." At that, Galadriel stepped forward and placed her hand upon a tree beside her. The bark glowed faintly at her touch, and the light spread up the trunk, rippling like water in moonlight. "Then we must decide now," she said. "What shall be done? For if the fire rises, and the world is not prepared, then the cycle will begin again. Rage, ruin, retreat. But perhaps, this time, it may be broken." Elrond turned to Gandalf, his voice steady but solemn. "Do you believe it can be stopped?" "I do not know," Gandalf admitted, "but I believe it can be met, not with swords or spells, but with presence, with memory. The flame is not yet free, but it is listening, watching. If we can understand its purpose, truly understand it, perhaps we can unbind the chain before it tightens." "Then we must go to the flame," Glorfindel said, his eyes fierce. "Not to fight it, but to confront it, to bring to it the light it once denied." "There is danger," Radagast warned, "in stepping so close to ancient fire. It may consume more than flesh. It may burn into the soul." Gandalf looked up at the canopy above, where the light shimmered through golden leaves. "Then we must walk with care," he said, "but walk we must. For if we do nothing, it will rise alone. And then, not even the strongholds of the West will stand." The council stood in agreement. Plans were whispered between them, runes drawn in the air, paths marked upon parchment, songs of shielding recalled from the elder days. Galadriel would call upon the waters of Lorien to weave protection around the Vale. Elrond would send word east to those still loyal in the hidden houses of Rivendell. Radagast would speak to the creatures of the land and learn what tremors they felt beneath the hills. And Glorfindel, brave and bright, would ride with Gandalf toward the place where the flame now waited. As the council dispersed, Gandalf remained behind a moment longer, his eyes upon the stream. In its reflection, he saw not his own face, but the memory of fire. A great shadow, wings like smoke, and a heart that burned with something older than hate. He knew what lay ahead would test not only his strength, but his spirit. Yet there was no fear in his heart, only purpose. The path was before him, and the light behind him. And though the fire waited, so too did hope, in the hands of those who still remembered the stars. The journey to the Western Gorge was veiled in silence, save for the steady rhythm of hooves and the wind that sighed through the canyons like a memory too old to name. Gandalf and Glorfindel rode without haste, but with unwavering purpose, their cloaks billowing behind them, grey and gold against the backdrop of ash-coloured cliffs. The mountains here bore no names on maps, yet the land remembered. Old stone groaned under their steps, and the birds flew wide arcs around the peaks, avoiding the air above the fissure. As they neared the place where the fire had stirred, where Yargzun, the Balrog forgotten by time, now slumbered beneath a veil of molten stone, the light began to shift. Not dimmer, but older, as if the sun itself hesitated to gaze too long upon that place. They made camp on the ridge overlooking the chasm, though neither intended to sleep. The night was thick with unseen weight. Gandalf sat with his staff upright, watching the stars flicker above, drawing strength from their ancient fire. Glorfindel stood near the edge, eyes reflecting starlight, his expression unreadable. "I can feel it," he said at last, voice soft as falling snow. "The same pull I felt before I fell to death. But this one waits. The fire here does not seek prey. It seeks a mirror, something that understands it." Gandalf nodded, understanding more deeply than words could say. This was not the same fury that once raged through Moria. Yarogzun had not awakened to destroy. It had awakened to remember. When morning broke, grey and gold, they descended. The path down into the gorge was narrow, carved more by time than hands. The walls rose high on either side, streaked with black veins that pulsed faintly with warmth. There was no wind, no sound, only the soft crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the growing hum beneath the soles of their feet. At the base of the gorge, a cave yawned open, tall, jagged, ringed with char and ancient runes melted nearly beyond recognition. They entered without words. The darkness inside was total at first, but Gandalf's staff lit softly, casting halos of pale light onto the carved walls. Then, slowly, like a heart beating awake, the fire responded. From the far end of the chamber, the flame came, not as a blaze, but a presence. It did not burst forth, nor did it roar. It breathed. A low sound, like a great forge exhaling heat, rolled over them. The shadows shifted, and from within the cavern's heart, Yarogzun emerged. Not fully, but as a shape behind fire. Its body a suggestion of wings and horns. Its eyes two molten rivers that saw not with rage, but with memory. Glorfindel stepped forward, sword unraised, hands empty. "We do not come to chain you," he said, voice calm and clear. "We come to understand." The Balrog did not answer with words, but with presence. The heat thickened, and within it came visions, not of destruction, but of beginnings. A time before the fall, before the first war, when fire had purpose not twisted by hate. Gandalf saw a forge not of war, but of creation. He saw the Valar crafting light, and the Maya dancing through flame like sculptors in the air. Yarogzun had been part of that once, before Morgoth, before Shadow. And then came the betrayal, the corruption, the long fall into rage. The fire had forgotten itself. Until now. Gandalf stepped closer, staff lowered, and he spoke, not in common speech, but in the ancient tongue of the Ainur. "You remember," he said. "You remember who you were, what you were meant to be." The Balrog's flames flickered, not with threat, but with conflict. A shudder ran through the cave. Stones cracked. The heat surged, but held. Then, slowly, like a mountain shifting in its sleep, Yarogzun bowed its head, not in submission, but in recognition. It was not peace, but it was choice. Gandalf extended his staff, and from its tip rose a silver flame, not hot, but bright, a memory of the light of Telperion, the elder tree. The silver light met the orange blaze, and for a moment, both flared. Fire did not consume fire, it embraced it. The chamber trembled, the shadows cried out, not from fear, but from release. Then, with a final exhalation, Yarogzun retreated, not banished, but returned to rest. Its flame pulled inward, deeper than stone, and the air cooled with sudden grace. The cave grew quiet again, not empty, but healed. Gandalf turned, and Glorfindel followed, the silence between them now sacred. As they climbed from the gorge, the sky brightened with soft light. Not the harsh gold of noon, but the gentle silver of promise. "You reached it," Glorfindel said at last, wonder in his voice. "Not as a warrior, not as a master of fire, but as a keeper of memory." Gandalf smiled, weary but whole. Fire can forget its purpose, but it can also remember. He looked east, to the mountains and forests beyond. And now, we must help the others remember too, that not all fire is for burning, some is for forging. When they returned to Lindon, the others were waiting. Galadriel read their faces before they spoke and nodded once, as though a burden had lifted. Elrond listened to the tale, then sent word across the lands that the danger had passed. For now. Radagast whispered to the trees, and even they seemed to breathe easier. And Glorfindel, bright and steady, watched the stars that night, with a fire in his heart no longer born of fear, but of understanding. And Gandalf, he sat beneath an ancient tree and smoked his pipe, watching the smoke curl toward the heavens. He did not speak of what he had seen, not in full. Some truths were not meant to be written, only lived. But he knew that something had changed, not just in the deep earth, but in himself. A part of the old fire had been healed, Not destroyed, not forgotten, but guided home. And in the heart of the Western Mountains, far below, a single flame pulsed gently, no longer waiting to rise, but remembering why it once burned. And so the fire sleeps once more, not in chains, not in anger, but in remembrance. Gandalf, weary yet wiser, has walked the path few dare to tread, not through battle alone, but through understanding. The mountains hold their silence again, cradling the ancient flame deep within stone, and Middle-earth breathes a little softer. As the stars return to their steady shimmer above Linden, and the wind carries only the songs of trees and rivers, we too are reminded that not all power is meant to be feared. Some fires, when seen with kindness, reveal not destruction, but the warmth of beginnings long forgotten. If your eyes are getting heavy now, let them close. Let your mind drift gently, like smoke curling from Gandalf's pipe into the starlit sky. The road has been long, but you've followed it with courage and wonder. You are safe here, in this quiet moment. The world outside can wait. For now, you're wrapped in the hush of Middle-earth, where time slows and dreams remember old magic. Thank you for spending your evening here with me. Sleep well, dream deep, and until next time, may your heart always find its way back to peace.